The creek ran lower that summer than anyone could remember. Brendan Mackay crouched beside the exposed bank, his fishing rod forgotten in the grass. What caught his attention wasn't the glint of a lost button or the weathered handle of some forgotten tool. It was the perfect arch of a small skull, no larger than his fist, emerging from decades of accumulated silt, like some terrible flower blooming in reverse. Beside it lay another. The drought of 1973 had pulled secrets from the mountain streams across eastern Kentucky, but nothing quite like this. Two skulls, side by side, positioned with an almost deliberate care that made Brendan's hands shake as he reached for his truck keys. In 1909, twin sisters named Kendrick and Verena had walked into these same mountains on a bright October morning. Their mother packed them biscuits. Their father reminded them to stay on the familiar trails. The community searched for weeks. No one had thought to drain the creek. Now, 64 years later, the mountain was returning its dead, and with them questions that certain people had spent a lifetime hoping would stay buried. The morning mist clung to Deadfall Hollow like smoke from last night's fires, carrying the scent of wet limestone and rotting leaves. October of 1909 had arrived early in the Kentucky mountains, painting the ridgelines in shades of rust and gold that would have been beautiful if anyone had time to notice. Kendrick and Verena moved through their morning chores with the practiced efficiency of 12-year-old twins who had learned that survival meant pulling your weight. Kendrick, older by 17 minutes and fiercer by nature, hauled water from the well while Verena gathered eggs from their handful of scrawny hens. Their breath made small clouds in the cool air as they worked, a rhythm as natural as the mountain itself. Their father, Soren, sat on the porch mending a harness, his weathered hands moving with the slow precision of a man who knew that rushing meant mistakes, and mistakes meant hunger. He'd worked the coal seams deeper in the mountain until a cave-in 2 summers back had left him with a limp and a persistent cough that sounded like gravel in a tin cup. "Girls," he called, not looking up from his work. "Mind you stay clear of the upper reaches today. Heard tell there's been some blasting up near Widow's Peak." Elindra emerged from the cabin, wiping flour from her hands on a threadbare apron. She was a small woman who seemed to exist in a state of constant motion, as if stillness might invite the kind of thoughts that could break a person in half. "There's biscuits and honey for your lunch," she said, handing Verena a cloth bundle. "And mind you don't go wandering off the marked trails." The twins nodded with the automatic obedience of children raised in a place where the mountains themselves could kill you if you didn't show proper respect. They'd been walking these ridges since they could toddle, knew every deer path and rock slide, every place where the limestone gave way to soft earth that could swallow an ankle or worse. But even mountain children couldn't know everything, especially about the things that grown-ups worked very hard to keep hidden. Kendrick shouldered her small pack and checked that Verena had tied her bootlaces properly. "We'll be back before supper," she promised, though the words felt strange in her mouth, heavy with a weight she didn't understand. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist and revealing the true scope of their world. Ridge after ridge rolled away into the distance, each one darker and more mysterious than the last. Somewhere up there, in places marked on no map, men were moving through the shadows with purposes that had nothing to do with children or safety or the simple rhythms of mountain life. The twins set off up the familiar trail, their voices carrying on the crisp air as they planned their day. Behind them, Soren watched until they disappeared around the first bend, then went back to his mending with hands that trembled just slightly more than arthritis alone could explain. The trail wound upward through stands of oak and hickory, their leaves rustling overhead like whispered warnings. Kendrick led the way with Verena close behind, their feet finding purchase on stones worn smooth by generations of mountain folk who had walked this same path to hunt, to gather herbs, to escape whatever drove them into the high country. "Look there," Verena pointed to a hawk circling high above the canopy. "Mama says when you see a hawk alone like that, it means change is coming." Kendrick snorted. "Mama says a lot of things. Doesn't mean they're all true." But she watched the bird anyway, noting how it seemed to be following them, riding the air currents with impatience that made her uneasy. They'd been walking for nearly 2 hours when they heard it. The steady rhythm of picks striking stone, echoing down from somewhere higher up the mountain. It wasn't the random sound of a lone prospector working a claim. This had the organized cadence of serious work, men moving with purpose and urgency. "Daddy said to stay away from the blasting," Verena whispered, though they both knew the sound they were hearing wasn't explosives. This was handwork, careful and deliberate. Kendrick paused at a fork in the trail. To the left, the path continued toward the berry patches they'd planned to visit. To the right, a narrower track climbed toward the source of that rhythmic striking. She was 12 years old, raised in a world where curiosity was often the difference between eating and going hungry, where knowing your surroundings could save your life. "Just a quick look," she said. "We won't get close." The decision would echo through decades. They climbed higher, moving more carefully now, placing their feet with the instinctive stealth that mountain children learned early. The picking sounds grew, clearer, accompanied now by voices, low and urgent. Through the trees ahead, they could see movement, figures bent over what looked like a fresh excavation carved into the hillside. But this wasn't any coal seam. The material being hauled out in wooden buckets gleamed dull silver in the dappled sunlight. Even from their hiding place 50 yards away, the twins could see that whatever these men were digging, it wasn't something they wanted the rest of the world to know about. Arik Caldwell stood near the entrance, his expensive city clothes incongruous in the mountain setting. Beside him, Sheriff Elvin kept watch while 3 local men worked the face with picks and shovels. The operation had the feel of something that had been going on for a while, well organized and profitable. Kendrick and Verena crouched behind a fallen log, barely breathing. They couldn't hear the words being spoken, but they could read the body language. Urgent, secretive, dangerous. That's when Verena's foot slipped on loose shale. The sound was small, just a few pebbles rattling down the slope. But in the mountain silence, it might as well have been a gunshot. Every head turned toward their hiding place. Sheriff Elvin's hand moved to his gun even before his eyes found their hiding spot. He was a thin man with the pale complexion of someone who spent more time in saloons than saddles, appointed to his position through political connections rather than any particular talent for law enforcement. But he knew enough to recognize a threat when he saw one. "There," he called, pointing directly at the fallen log where the twins crouched frozen. Behind the deadfall, Arik Caldwell cursed and dropped his clipboard. The mine foreman barked orders to his crew, who abandoned their tools and began moving toward the children's position with the coordinated efficiency of men who had handled problems like this before. Kendrick grabbed Verena's hand. "Run!" They crashed through the underbrush, abandoning any pretense of stealth for pure speed. Behind them, heavy boots pounded against stone and earth, voices shouting coordinates and directions. The twins knew these mountains, but the men chasing them knew them too. And more importantly, the men had longer legs and the desperate motivation of people protecting a secret worth killing for. This way, Kendrick gasped, pulling Verena toward a barely visible deer path that switched back down the steep slope toward the creek bottom. If they could reach the water, they could follow it downstream to where it joined the main branch. From there, they could work their way back toward home through terrain too rough for horses. The sound of pursuit grew closer. Sheriff Elvin's voice carried through the trees, directing his men to fan out and cut off possible escape routes. These weren't random mountain folk the twins were running from. This was an organized effort by people who had too much to lose to let two children stumble home with stories about secret mining operations. They reached the creek bank at a dead run, their boots skidding on wet stones as they plunged into water that ran knee-deep and cold as winter. The current tugged at their legs, treacherous with hidden rocks and sudden drop-offs that could break bones, or worse. "The cave!" Verena pointed toward a dark opening in the limestone bank just upstream. "We can hide until they give up." It seemed like salvation, a place to catch their breath, to wait out the search, to plan their way home. Kendrick nodded, and they waded toward the opening, their feet numb with cold and fear. Neither of them noticed Arik Caldwell positioned on the ridge above, watching their every move through field glasses. Neither of them saw him gesture to his men or heard him give the order that would seal their fate. They splashed into the cave entrance just as the first charges exploded. The mountain shook. Stones rained down from the ceiling, and somewhere above them, water that had run free for thousands of years began its slow, inexorable shift toward a new channel. The mountain keeps its secrets. By evening, when Soren and Alindra realized their daughters hadn't come home, the search was already over. The men who might have found them were busy elsewhere, explaining to concerned neighbors why blasting operations sometimes went wrong, why cave-ins happened, why the creek now ran muddy with disturbed sediment. Sheriff Elvin organized the official search party with great show and little substance. They looked in all the right places and found exactly what they expected to find. Nothing. Two girls lost in the vast wilderness, victims of their own curiosity and the mountain's indifferent appetite for the unwary. The community would look for weeks. They would pray and organize and exhaust themselves searching every ridge and hollow. But they would never find what they were looking for, because the people who could have led them to the right place were too busy protecting their investment to worry about two dead children. 3 days after the twins disappeared, Soren stood in his doorway watching search parties form up in the pre-dawn darkness. Men he'd known his entire life gathered in small groups, checking rope and comparing maps by lamplight. Their voices carried the forced optimism of people trying to convince themselves that hope remained possible. Alindra hadn't slept since the first night. She moved through the cabin like a ghost, preparing meals for searchers who arrived hollow-eyed and empty-handed, asking the same questions over and over. Where might they have gone? What were their favorite places? Did they have hiding spots known only to them? The questions felt like accusations. Good parents would know these things. Good parents wouldn't have let their children wander off into country that could swallow a grown man without trace. They're experienced mountain children, Sheriff Elvin reminded the assembled volunteers, his badge glinting in the lantern, light. Smart girls who know these ridges better than most. If they're taking shelter somewhere, they'll have picked a good spot. Phyla Hutchins nodded from the edge of the group. She lived closest to the Deadfall Hollow Trail and had known the twins since birth. Kendrick's got sense enough for both of them, she said. And Verena's got eyes like a hawk. If anyone could survive a night or two in rough country, it'd be those two. But privately, She wondered why Sheriff Elvin seemed more interested in controlling the search than expanding it. Why certain areas remained off-limits due to industrial operations that nobody could quite explain. Why the creek ran muddy when it should have been running clear. Azenra Willis, the local church deacon, organized prayer groups and distributed hand-drawn maps marked with grid sections for systematic coverage. She was a practical woman who believed that God helped those who helped themselves. But even she noticed how certain volunteers seemed more concerned with making sure searchers stayed in designated areas than actually finding missing children. Peculiar thing, she mentioned to Fela after the morning briefing. 3 separate folks told me different stories about why we can't search up near Widow's Peak. Industrial work, unstable geology, property disputes. Which is it? Fela glanced around to make sure they couldn't be overheard. Been wondering the same thing myself. Walked that ridge just last month hunting ginseng. Didn't see any signs of industrial work then. Something moves in the darkness. By the 4th day, the search had taken on the grinding routine of an impossible task. Men climbed the same ridges they'd climbed the day before, knowing they would find nothing but unable to admit defeat. Women organized meals and supply stations, keeping busy to avoid thinking about what it meant if the girls weren't found soon. Soren walked farther each day, his injured leg screaming with every step. He searched places that made no sense for 2 children to visit. Rock faces too steep to climb, ravines too deep to survive falling into, cave systems that honeycombed the mountain's interior like Swiss cheese. "You're killing yourself out there," Elindra told him on the 5th night, watching him collapse into his chair without bothering to remove his muddy boots. "Dead on your feet won't bring them back." "Sitting here won't either," he replied, but the fight had gone out of his voice. He'd begun to understand what the searchers were too kind to say directly. After 5 days in October weather, the best they could hope for now was bodies. That night, for the first time since the girls disappeared, Sheriff Elvin slept soundly in his own bed. The immediate crisis was passing. The search would continue for a few more days, then gradually wind down as participants returned to their own pressing concerns. The families most likely to ask uncomfortable questions about restricted search areas would be too exhausted by grief to pursue the matter. Everything was proceeding exactly as Auric Caldwell had predicted it would. Auric Caldwell had learned patience during 15 years of extracting wealth from mountains that didn't want to give it up. He sat in the Deadfall Hollow Mercantile, drinking coffee that tasted like it had been boiled with horseshoes and listening to local conversation with the focused attention of a man whose livelihood depended on knowing which way the wind was blowing. "Still no sign," Fela was telling the storekeeper. "Been a week now. Soren's wearing himself down to bone-walking every ridge from here to Virginia." The storekeeper, a pragmatic man named Tolliver, shook his head. "Mountains got too many places to hide someone who doesn't want to be found, or too many places to lose someone who had the misfortune to fall into the wrong hole." Caldwell sipped his coffee and said nothing. He'd learned that people revealed more when they thought he wasn't listening. The silver operation up near Widow's Peak was worth more money than anyone in this hollow had ever imagined. But it was also illegal as hell. Federal mining inspectors would ask awkward questions about environmental damage, safety protocols, and worker compensation. Local officials were easier to manage, as long as the right people stayed in the right offices. "Sheriff's been working day and night," Fela continued, "organizing search grids, coordinating with neighboring counties. Man's barely slept since this started." What Fela didn't mention, because she didn't know it, was that Sheriff Elvin's devotion to the search effort was precisely calculated to avoid finding anything. His carefully organized grid system steered searchers away from the blast zone and toward areas he knew had already been thoroughly scoured. His coordination with neighboring counties consisted mainly of sharing information that would keep outside agencies from getting too interested in Deadfall Hollow's internal affairs. "Heard tell they might bring in federal trackers," Tolliver mentioned casually. "Professionals with bloodhounds and such." Caldwell's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. This was the first he'd heard of federal involvement. That could complicate things considerably. "Who's talking about federal trackers?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. "Soren mentioned it to Deacon Willis yesterday," Phyla replied. "Said he'd written a letter to the state capitol requesting assistance. Figure if local search efforts aren't sufficient, might be time to bring in outside expertise. The mountain remembers everything." That evening, Caldwell rode up to the mining site for an emergency conference with his foreman and Sheriff Elvin. The operation had been suspended since the incident, but equipment still cluttered the excavation area, and silver ore sat in neat piles awaiting transport. "Federal involvement could expose the entire operation," Caldwell said without preamble. "Professional trackers might ask questions about why certain areas have been declared off-limits. They might notice blast residue or equipment marks." Sheriff Elvin spat into the dirt. "Local search efforts winding down naturally. Give it another week and folks will start accepting that those girls are gone for good. No need for federal anything." "Unless Soren keeps pushing," the foreman interjected. "Man's desperate enough to make a lot of noise if he thinks it might bring his daughters home." They stood silent for a moment, looking down at the creek that now ran in a slightly different channel than it had 2 weeks earlier. The water moved over loose stone and accumulated sediment, cutting new patterns in the limestone bedrock with the patient persistence that only water possessed. "Soren's not the problem," Caldwell said finally. "Grief makes people do desperate things, but it also wears them down. Give him time and he'll exhaust himself into acceptance." What worried Caldwell more were the people like Phyla and Azenra, who asked quiet questions and remembered inconvenient details. People who might wonder why a mining operation nobody had heard of could generate enough profit to keep a sheriff cooperative and a state mining inspector conveniently absent. The silver would keep coming out of the mountain, just more carefully and with better security. The creek would eventually run clear again, and 2 missing children would become just another mountain tragedy, the kind of thing that happened when people lived too close to country that didn't care whether they survived or not. The Deadfall Hollow Baptist Church occupied a plot of level ground so rare in the mountains that early settlers had considered it a gift from God himself. Deacon Azenra Willis stood behind the rough-hewn pulpit that Sunday morning, looking out at faces marked by exhaustion and worry. 2 weeks had passed since the twins disappeared, and the community was beginning to fracture under the weight of unanswered questions. "We're gathered today to pray for Kendrick and Verena," Azenra began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had buried 3 husbands and raised 7 children to adulthood. "And to support Soren and Alindra in their time of trial." The congregation murmured agreement, but several pews remained conspicuously empty. Auric Caldwell sat near the back, his city clothes and watchful demeanor setting him apart from the worn work clothes and calloused hands around him. Sheriff Elvin occupied his usual seat in the 3rd row, though he seemed more interested in watching who attended than participating in worship. "Lord knows we've searched every ridge and hollow," continued Azenra. "Walked paths we've walked 1,000 times, and places we'd never thought to look. But sometimes the mountain keeps its secrets, and we have to trust that your will is being done, even when we can't understand the purpose." Soren sat rigid in the front pew. Elindra beside him clutching a handkerchief that had been twisted into rags. Neither had spoken much since the search parties started coming back empty-handed. What words were there for parents watching their neighbors give up hope? Been thinking about the parable of the lost sheep, Azenra said. How the shepherd left 99 safe in the fold to search for the one that wandered away. Sometimes I wonder if we're the 99, safe in our hollow, while 2 of our own are still out there needing to be found. Phyla Hutchins shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She'd been wrestling with disturbing thoughts for days, questions that seemed disloyal to even consider. Why had certain areas been declared off-limits to searchers? Why did the creek run muddy when there hadn't been enough rain to stir up sediment? Why did Sheriff Elvin seem more interested in managing the search than expanding it? "Deacon," she called out, standing despite the breach of church protocol. "Maybe we should talk about why some areas got marked as too dangerous to search. Seems like if my children were missing, I'd want to look everywhere, dangerous or not." An uncomfortable silence settled over the congregation. This kind of direct challenge to authority didn't happen in Deadfall Hollow, where survival depended on everyone knowing their place and staying in it. Sheriff Elvin cleared his throat. "Industrial operations up near Widow's Peak make that area too hazardous for civilian searchers. Unstable excavations, blasting debris, potential cave-ins. Wouldn't want to add more casualties to this tragedy." "What industrial operations?" Phyla persisted. "I've hunted ginseng all through that country. Never seen any signs of mining or timber work." "What would you do?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a green fire. What would you do if you knew something was wrong but couldn't prove it? If challenging the official story might make you the next person to disappear? If asking the wrong questions could cost you your job, your standing in the community, your safety? Most people faced with that choice would sit down and keep quiet. Most people would decide that their own families needed them alive, and present more than dead children needed justice. Most people would convince themselves that grief was making them paranoid, that officials knew best, that sometimes terrible things just happened without explanation. Phyla Hutchins was not most people. "I think we should organize our own search of that area," she said, "independent of the official effort. If there's really industrial work going on, we'll see evidence of it. If there's not..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Everyone in the church understood what it would mean if the restricted areas contained no signs of the industrial work that supposedly made them too dangerous to search. Auric Caldwell stood up. "I think emotions are running high," he said carefully. "Understandable given the circumstances. But second-guessing, professional search efforts won't bring those girls home. Sometimes we have to accept that mountains are dangerous places, and accidents happen." The word accidents hit Soren like a physical blow. He rose slowly, turned to face the congregation with eyes that burned like coals. "My daughters didn't have an accident," he said quietly. "They're mountain children, born and raised here. They know every rock and route between here and the county line." His voice grew stronger. "And I'll search every inch of this mountain until I find them, whether certain areas are convenient or not." The meeting took place in the back room of Tolliver's Mercantile 3 days after Phyla's church outburst. Auric Caldwell had requested privacy for business discussions, which in a place like Deadfall Hollow meant everyone knew exactly what was happening, but pretended they didn't. Sheriff Elvin arrived first, nervous energy making him pace the small space between stacked flour barrels and hanging sides of salt pork. He'd been law enforcement in 3 counties over the past 15 years, always managing to stay one step ahead of serious scrutiny, always finding patrons who valued loyalty over competence. "This is getting out of hand," he said as Caldwell entered. "That Hutchins woman's got people asking questions, starting to organize independent search efforts. Pretty soon we'll have half the county tramping around up there." Caldwell settled into the room's single chair, a man comfortable with authority and the difficult decisions it sometimes required. The silver operation was generating more money per month than the entire hollow saw in a year. But profit meant nothing if federal investigators started asking questions about environmental damage and safety violations. "How much does Fela actually know?" he asked. "Nothing concrete, but she's got instincts, and she's not afraid to follow them. Type of woman who notices when things don't add up." Elvin stopped pacing and faced Caldwell directly. "Question is, how far are you willing to go to protect this operation?" The question contained its own answer. They'd already killed 2 children to keep their secret. The logical next step was eliminating anyone who might expose what had happened. But murder had a way of generating its own problems, especially in a community small enough that everyone noticed when neighbors disappeared. "What about Soren?" Caldwell asked. "Still making noise about federal trackers?" "Sent another letter to the state capitol yesterday. Also wrote to a newspaper in Lexington about lack of cooperation from local authorities. Man's not giving up. The dead speak through the living." Caldwell considered his options. The smart move would be to suspend operations, relocate to another mountain, start fresh somewhere without complications. But the silver vein near Widow's Peak was the richest he'd found in 20 years of illegal mining. Walking away now would cost him a fortune. "There's another approach," he said finally. "Instead of stopping people from searching, we help them search, guide them to the right conclusions." Elvin looked puzzled. "What conclusions?" "That the girls had an accident, fell into a sinkhole, got caught in a flash flood, wandered off, and died of exposure. Something tragic but natural, with no one to blame except bad luck and the mountain's indifferent appetite." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. They would discover evidence that led searchers away from the blast zone and toward a plausible accident site. Personal effects planted in the right location, signs of a struggle with natural hazards, maybe even some torn clothing caught on thorns near a treacherous creek crossing. "People want closure," Caldwell explained. "Give them a story that makes sense, evidence that confirms their worst fears, and they'll stop asking uncomfortable questions. Grief is easier to bear when you know what you're grieving for." Sheriff Elvin nodded slowly. It was a good plan, the kind of misdirection that had served him well in previous counties. But it required careful timing and precise execution. Plant the evidence too quickly, and people would be suspicious. Wait too long, and independent search efforts might stumble onto the real crime scene. "What about the Hutchins woman?" Elvin asked. "She's the key," Caldwell replied. "She's the one asking questions, organizing resistance. If we can satisfy her that the official explanation is correct, everyone else will fall in line." They spent another hour working out details. Which evidence to plant, where to plant it, how to ensure the right people found it. The conversation had the matter-of-fact quality of men discussing crop rotations or livestock breeding, practical considerations for managing a difficult but necessary task. Neither mentioned the twins by name. They had become an abstract problem, a threat to be managed rather than children who had died terrified and alone in a limestone cave. Distance made the work bearable. Abstraction made it possible. Outside, October rain drummed against the mercantile's tin roof, washing autumn leaves down mountain streams that ran higher and faster than usual. The creek near Widow's Peak carved new channels through loose sediment, patient as geological time, carrying secrets toward places where they might someday resurface. Phyla found the hair ribbon on a Tuesday morning, tangled in blackberry briars along Bitter Creek, 3 miles downstream from where the twins were last seen. It was blue cotton, faded but recognizable, exactly the kind that Alindra braided into Verena's hair every Sunday for church. She almost missed it. The morning mist hung thick in the creek bottom, and she was focused on checking rabbit snares she'd set the week before. But something blue caught her peripheral vision, a color that didn't belong among the browns and grays of late autumn woods. "Lord help me," she whispered, carefully extricating the ribbon from the thorns. It was torn in 2 places and stained with what might have been mud or might have been something else entirely. The discovery sent shockwaves through the hollow. Sheriff Elvin organized an intensive search of the area around Bitter Creek, bringing in volunteers who had given up hope of finding anything after 3 weeks of futile effort. The ribbon suggested that the twins had made it farther than anyone realized, before whatever happened to them happened. "This changes everything," Soren told the assembled search party. They were moving downstream, probably following the water when they got lost. "We need to check every pool, every undercut bank, every place where someone might take shelter." Azenra Willis nodded agreement, but privately she wondered about the condition of the ribbon. 3 weeks of mountain weather should have degraded the fabric more than what she was seeing, and the location bothered her too. Why would 2 experienced mountain children follow Bitter Creek when it led away from home rather than toward it? Someone watches from the shadows, but doubt was a luxury that grieving parents couldn't afford. Soren threw himself into the renewed search effort with desperate energy, convinced that physical evidence meant his daughters were alive somewhere, hiding or hurt, but still breathing. Alindra followed close behind, her hollow eyes scanning every rock and root for signs that her children had passed this way. The second piece of evidence appeared 2 days later. Kendrick's pocket knife, found wedged between stones in a shallow pool 50 yards downstream from the ribbon. The blade was extended as if she'd been trying to cut something, and there were fibers caught in the mechanism that might have come from a rope. "They were trying to cross here," Sheriff Elvin explained to the crowd that gathered around the pool. "Current's stronger than it looks, especially after recent rains. Easy for someone to slip, get pulled downstream, maybe trapped under debris." Arik Caldwell stood at the edge of the group, watching faces rather than examining evidence. He was looking for signs that anyone suspected the discovery was too convenient, that physical evidence was appearing exactly where and when it would be most useful for supporting a particular narrative. Most faces showed only relief that the mystery was finally being solved. Mountain people understood drowning, understood how fast-moving water could turn deadly without warning. It was the kind of accident that happened every year, the kind of tragedy that didn't require villains or conspiracies to explain. But Phyla's expression remained skeptical. She kept studying the knife's condition, the way the fibers were caught in the blade mechanism, the precise placement between stones that should have been scoured clean by flowing water. "Something's not right," she told Azenra after the crowd dispersed. "That knife's been placed, not dropped, and those fibers are fresh, not weathered, like they should be after 3 weeks in the creek." Azenra glanced around nervously. "Maybe you're seeing things that aren't there," she said. "Sometimes when we want answers badly enough, we convince ourselves that simple explanations aren't sufficient." But her words carried no conviction. She'd noticed the same inconsistencies, the same troubling details that didn't quite fit the official story. The question was whether pointing them out would bring justice for dead children, or just create more tragedy for the living. That night, Sheriff Elvin made his report to Auric Caldwell with the satisfaction of a job well done. The evidence was working exactly as planned. Public attention was now focused on Bitter Creek, rather than the restricted areas near Widow's Peak. The search effort had been redirected toward finding bodies rather than questioning authority. "One more piece of evidence should do it," Caldwell said. "Something that confirms they drowned and makes it clear that further searching would be futile." They were so close to closure, so close to transforming a double murder into a tragic accident that everyone could accept and eventually forget. Just one more planted item, and the investigation would conclude with handshakes and condolences rather than handcuffs and grand jury indictments. But neither man had counted on the mountain's own timeline for revealing secrets. Water has patience that criminals lack, and the willingness to wait decades for the right moment to speak. By 1912, Soren walked with the bent shoulders of a man who had searched every creek bed and cave mouth in 3 counties without finding what he was looking for. The official conclusion was drowning, bodies swept downstream during an unseasonable flood that struck 2 days after the twins disappeared. The evidence seemed conclusive. Personal effects found along Bitter Creek, signs of attempted river crossing, witness reports of dangerously high water levels. But Soren knew his daughters, knew they were too smart to attempt a dangerous crossing, too experienced to be caught off guard by rising water. He'd taught them to read creek conditions before they could read books, to recognize the signs that meant flash flood danger and the subtle changes that indicated safe passage. Still, what was the alternative? That someone in their own community had killed 2 children and successfully covered it up? That neighbors he'd known his entire life were capable of looking him in the eye while concealing murder? The mind recoiled from such possibilities, preferring even implausible accidents to deliberate evil. Elindra had stopped speaking sometime during the 4th year. She moved through daily routines with mechanical precision, cooking meals that went largely uneaten, tending a garden that produced more vegetables than they could possibly consume. Grief had carved her down to essential functions, leaving no energy for conversation or comfort or the small gestures that made life bearable. The hollow itself had changed too. Families moved away, seeking opportunities in coal towns or factory cities where the past didn't watch from every ridge and stream. New residents arrived with no connection to the tragedy, no memory of 2 bright-eyed girls who had vanished into morning mist. Auric Caldwell's mining operation expanded quietly, systematically extracting silver from veins that seemed to grow richer the deeper they dug. The money was laundered through legitimate businesses in Lexington and Louisville, creating a paper trail that led nowhere suspicious. Sheriff Elvin used his share to buy a small farm in the next county, planning his eventual retirement from law enforcement. Time covers all wounds. Phyla Hutchins remained the Hollow's unofficial keeper of uncomfortable questions. She'd never accepted the drowning explanation, had never stopped noticing details that didn't fit the official story. But questioning authority was a luxury she couldn't afford indefinitely. Her own children needed food and shelter more than dead neighbors needed justice. "Let it go, Phyla," her husband told her one evening as she pored over hand-drawn maps of the search areas. "Been 5 years now. Whatever happened to those girls, it's finished. All this worry won't bring them back." She wanted to let it go. Wanted to believe that some tragedies were genuinely random, that her community was fundamentally decent, that people she'd trusted with her own children's safety were worthy of that trust. But doubt had taken root in her mind like kudzu, growing stronger with time rather than weaker. The breakthrough came in 1915, when federal mining inspectors finally arrived to investigate reports of unauthorized extraction in the area. Arik Caldwell had grown careless over the years, confident that local cooperation would prevent outside interference indefinitely. He'd underestimated both the persistence of anonymous letter writers and the federal government's renewed interest in regulating mountain industries. The inspectors found evidence of extensive mining operations near Widow's Peak, including blast residue, equipment marks, and environmental damage consistent with years of silver extraction. They also found something else: geological surveys that indicated the blast pattern used in 1909 had permanently altered local watercourses, redirecting Bitter Creek's flow and creating new underground channels. Interesting, the lead inspector noted in his report. Creek appears to have changed course sometime around 1909, based on vegetation patterns and sediment deposits. Blast activity in this area would explain the hydraulic disruption. Phyla read that report in the county courthouse 6 months later, finally understanding why the creek had run muddy for weeks after the twins disappeared. Why certain areas had been declared off-limits to searchers. Why evidence had appeared so conveniently along the new channel rather than the old one. The truth hit her like a physical blow. Kendrick and Verena hadn't drowned in Bitter Creek. They'd been killed to silence them about illegal mining operations, their bodies hidden in ways that guaranteed they'd never be found. The revelation changed everything and nothing. Phyla now knew what had happened to the twins, but proving it was another matter entirely. The people responsible held positions of authority and had spent 6 years covering their tracks. Any attempt to expose them would require evidence that no longer existed and testimony from witnesses who had too much to lose by speaking the truth. She started with the geological survey, spending hours in the courthouse basement, comparing official documents with her own observations of the terrain. The federal inspectors had documented blast patterns and environmental damage, but they hadn't connected that damage to 2 missing children. Why would they? The disappearance had been officially ruled accidental drowning. Case closed. The mining operation started in 1908, she told Azenra during one of their careful conversations. Federal records show permits were requested but never approved. So whatever Caldwell was digging up there, he was doing it illegally. Azenra listened with the expression of someone who'd expected this conversation for years. Illegal mining's one thing, she said carefully. Murder's something else entirely. Big leap between those two. But Phyla had made the connection. The twins disappeared on October 15th, 1909. Federal survey shows major blast activity in that area on the same date. Activity that permanently altered the creek's flow pattern. That's not coincidence. She'd also identified inconsistencies in the evidence that had supposedly led searchers to conclude the girls had drowned. The ribbon was too well preserved for something that had been exposed to weather for 3 weeks. The pocket knife showed signs of recent placement rather than long submersion. The fibers caught in the blade mechanism were synthetic, not cotton or wool like the twins' clothing. Truth rises like groundwater. What are you planning to do with this information? Azenra asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Take it to the state police. Federal marshals if necessary. Someone with jurisdiction and no local connections. Phyla's voice carried a determination that 6 years of doubt had only strengthened. Those girls deserve justice, and their parents deserve to know what really happened. Azenra considered the risks. Accusing a sheriff and a prominent businessman of murder would require proof beyond reasonable doubt, evidence that could withstand cross-examination by expensive lawyers. the kind of evidence that existed mainly in the memories of people who had every reason to keep quiet. "You realize what you're up against," she said. "Caldwell's got money and connections. Elvin's got a badge and 6 years of accepted truth on his side. And you've got what? Geological surveys and suspicious timing. I've got 2 dead children and a community that's been living with lies for 6 years," Phyla replied. "Sometimes that's enough to start with. But starting an investigation and finishing it successfully were different challenges entirely." The next morning, Phyla's husband found a note tacked to their front door. "Some questions are better left unasked, for everyone's sake." The message was unsigned but clear. Someone had been watching her research, tracking her courthouse visits, monitoring her conversations with Azenra. Someone wanted her to understand that pursuing justice for dead children might result in similar justice for living adults. Phyla stared at the note for a long time, weighing her commitment to truth against her responsibility to her own family. The smart choice was obvious. Burn the research. Forget the questions. Accept that some secrets were too dangerous to expose. Instead, she rode to the county seat that afternoon and requested a meeting with the state police. The detective who heard her story was a young man named Morrison, recently transferred from Louisville and unfamiliar with local politics. He listened to her geological evidence, examined her timeline comparisons, and asked questions that suggested he understood the implications of what she was telling him. "This is serious stuff," he said after reviewing her materials. "But 6 years is a long time. Physical evidence deteriorates, witnesses develop selective memory, and people who might have been willing to talk initially often change their minds when they realize the personal costs involved. So you won't investigate?" "I didn't say that, but I want you to understand what you're asking for. If you're right about this, a lot of important people are going to be very unhappy with both of us. And if you're wrong..." He didn't finish the sentence. If she was wrong, she'd have destroyed her own reputation and endangered her family for nothing. If she was right, she'd have exposed a murder conspiracy that certain people had killed to protect. Either way, there was no going back. Detective Morrison's investigation began quietly, with requests for federal mining records and correspondence with geological survey teams that had worked the area around Widow's Peak. He was careful not to alert local authorities to his interest, conducting interviews in neighboring counties and using state resources rather than local ones. What he found confirmed Phyla's suspicions. The timeline was damning. Illegal mining operations, blast activity on the day the twins disappeared, immediate restriction of search areas that could have revealed evidence of the crime. More troubling was the pattern of evidence that had allegedly led searchers to conclude the girls had drowned, each item appearing exactly when and where it would be most useful for supporting the official story. "This wasn't random," Morrison told his supervisor during a briefing in the state capitol. "Someone orchestrated this cover-up from the beginning, using official authority to misdirect search efforts and plant evidence." His supervisor, a career police officer named Captain Hayes, studied the evidence with the grim expression of someone who'd seen similar corruption in coal towns and factory cities across the state. "Can you prove it in court? Grand jury's going to want more than suspicious timing and geological surveys." Morrison had been working on that problem. The key was finding someone with direct knowledge who was willing to testify, someone whose conscience had been eating at them for 6 years, and who might be ready to trade testimony for immunity from prosecution. He found that person in Tommy Bracken, one of the miners who'd worked Caldwell's illegal operation. Tommy had left Kentucky in 1910, moving his family to Ohio where coal work was legal, and didn't require killing children to maintain secrecy. But 6 years of guilt had taken their toll, and when Morrison tracked him down in a Cleveland boarding house, Tommy was ready to talk. "We heard the blast go off while we were working the face," Tommy said during their recorded interview. "Caldwell said it was just clearing debris from the entrance, but we all knew better. You don't use that much powder for clearing work." The mountain remembers everything. Tommy's testimony was devastating. He described finding evidence of the twins' presence near the cave entrance. Footprints, disturbed vegetation, a torn piece of fabric caught on limestone. He detailed Caldwell's orders to seal the entrance permanently and redirect the creek to hide blast damage. Most importantly, he identified other miners who could corroborate his story. "Those little girls saw something they shouldn't have seen," Tommy explained. "And Caldwell decided that was worth killing for. Rest of us, we were too scared to do anything but follow orders." Morrison spent 3 more weeks tracking down Tommy's former colleagues, building a case that could withstand the expensive legal challenges that Caldwell would certainly mount. 2 miners were dead, victims of coal mine accidents that might or might not have been accidental. But 3 others were alive and willing to testify in exchange for immunity from murder charges. The arrest warrants were signed in December of 1915. Sheriff Elvin was taken into custody at his home, charged with conspiracy to commit murder and obstruction of justice. Auric Caldwell was arrested at his hotel in Lexington, where he'd been negotiating the sale of mining equipment to interests in West Virginia. Both men maintained their innocence, claiming they'd done everything possible to find the missing children, and that any mining activity in the area was coincidental to the tragedy. Their lawyers argued that the state's case relied on the testimony of criminals seeking to avoid prosecution, that geological evidence was circumstantial at best, and that 6 years had passed without anyone finding bodies or definitive proof of murder. But the prosecution had one more surprise. During the investigation of the mining site, work crews had discovered human remains sealed behind blast debris in what had once been the entrance to a limestone cave. The bones were small, consistent with children aged 10 to 12, and still bore traces of fabric that matched descriptions of the clothes Kendrick and Verena had been wearing when they disappeared. The twins had finally come home, and with them, justice that was 6 years late but still strong enough to matter. The trial of Auric Caldwell and Elvin Willis began in the spring of 1916, in a Frankfurt courthouse deliberately chosen for its distance from the local politics and economic interests that had enabled the crime. Judge Harrison was a federal appointee with no connection to Kentucky mining interests and a reputation for refusing to be intimidated by powerful defendants. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Tommy Bracken and his fellow miners testified about the illegal mining operation, the discovery of the twins' presence near the cave, and Caldwell's decision to eliminate witnesses. Federal agents documented the blast patterns that had sealed the cave and redirected Bitter Creek. Geological experts explained how the evidence found downstream had been planted to support a false drowning narrative. Most powerfully, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison from the University of Kentucky Medical School testified about the condition of the remains found in the sealed cave. The bones showed no signs of drowning or natural death. Instead, they indicated that the twins had died from asphyxiation, trapped in an enclosed space with no possibility of escape. The pattern of bone deposition suggests the children were still alive when the cave entrance was sealed, Dr. Morrison explained to the horrified courtroom. They would have survived for several hours, possibly longer, before oxygen depletion made survival impossible. Caldwell's defense team, led by a prominent Louisville attorney named Patterson, argued that their client was guilty of illegal mining but not murder. The blast that sealed the cave had been intended to hide evidence of unauthorized extraction, not kill children. That the twins were trapped inside was a tragic accident, not deliberate homicide. My client's actions were criminal, Patterson admitted. He violated federal mining regulations and attempted to hide his activities from authorities. But killing children was never part of any plan. The blast was meant to conceal mining equipment, not commit murder. Justice moves like water through stone. Sheriff Elvin's defense was even more problematic. His attorney had to explain why a law enforcement officer had deliberately misdirected search efforts, planted false evidence, and maintained a conspiracy of silence for 6 years. The best he could do was argue that Elvin had been corrupted by money rather than motivated by malice, that his client had made terrible choices but hadn't intended for anyone to die. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous: guilty on all charges for both defendants. Judge Harrison sentenced Caldwell to life in prison for 2 counts of murder and conspiracy. Elvin received 20 years for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and abuse of authority. Soren and Alindra sat in the courtroom gallery throughout the trial, hearing details about their daughter's final hours that no parents should ever have to know. When the verdicts were read, Alindra began crying for the first time since the girls disappeared. Not tears of relief or satisfaction, but pure grief that had been held back by uncertainty for 6 years. They were scared, she whispered to Soren as they left the courthouse. They were trapped and scared, and we weren't there to help them. The trial had provided justice, but it couldn't restore innocence or erase the knowledge of how their children had died. It couldn't explain why neighbors they'd trusted had been willing to sacrifice 2 lives for silver money. It couldn't answer the larger questions about how much evil was possible when good people decided to look away. Phyla Hutchins received no official recognition for her role in bringing the case to justice. Detective Morrison mentioned her assistance in his reports, but the newspapers focused on official investigators and courtroom drama rather than the woman who'd spent 6 years asking uncomfortable questions. That was fine with her. Recognition wasn't what she'd been seeking. Truth was enough, and the knowledge that 2 children could rest in properly marked graves instead of anonymous limestone holes. Sometimes that was the best justice the mountain could provide. The mining site near Widow's Peak was permanently sealed and declared a federal preserve. The creek was allowed to return to its natural course, washing away the last physical evidence of Caldwell's operation. Within 5 years, you had to know exactly where to look to find any traces of what had happened there. But the mountain remembered. And sometimes, when the light was right and the mist hung low in the hollows, people claimed they could still hear children's voices calling from places where no children should be. 64 years after Kendrick and Verena walked into the mountains, the drought of 1973 exposed secrets that flowing water had kept hidden for generations. Brendan Mackay had been fishing the same stretch of creek since childhood, knew every pool and riffle, every place where rainbow trout gathered in the cool shadows beneath overhanging rocks. But the creek he found that July morning was different, reduced to a narrow channel threading between exposed banks that revealed the accumulated history of decades. Tree roots twisted through layers of sediment like skeleton fingers. Rusted cans and broken bottles emerged from mud that had covered them since the Depression. And there, in a bend where the water had carved a new course sometime in the distant past, human bones gleamed white against dark earth. Brendan was 62 years old enough to remember the stories about twin girls who'd vanished in 1909, young enough when it happened to have been fascinated rather than terrified by the mystery. His grandfather had been part of the search effort, had walked these same ridges looking for signs that never materialized. Two skulls side by side, he told Sheriff Hutchins, Fiala's son, who'd inherited his mother's skeptical nature, along with her position as the county's unofficial keeper of inconvenient truths. Positioned like someone laid them out careful-like, not scattered random the way you'd expect from flood action. Sheriff Hutchins studied the exposed bones with the methodical attention of someone who'd learned to read crime scenes in Vietnam before returning home to discover that the mountains kept their own varieties of violence. The position was definitely intentional. Two small skulls facing the same direction, placed with a precision that suggested ritual rather than accident. Been there a long time, he noted, examining sediment layers and vegetation patterns. Decades, maybe longer, but this isn't the original burial site. These bones were moved here from somewhere else, probably during high water events that scoured them from upstream locations. Time returns what time has taken. The discovery set off a careful excavation led by state forensic teams and University of Kentucky archaeologists. What they found told a story that matched historical records from the 1915 trial. Two children, approximately 12 years old, who had died from asphyxiation rather than drowning or trauma. The bones showed evidence of rapid burial in limestone cave sediment, followed by gradual exposure and transport downstream over many years. Dr. Sarah Coleman, the forensic anthropologist leading the investigation, explained the timeline to assembled reporters with the clinical precision of someone who'd spent her career translating bone evidence into courtroom testimony. These remains were originally buried in a sealed cave environment, probably around 1909 based on associated artifacts. Blast damage to the cave system sometime after burial allowed water infiltration, which gradually transported the bones downstream through underground channels before depositing them in the current location. The artifacts told their own story. Corroded buttons from 1909-era children's clothing, fragments of leather that had once been shoes, metal buckles, and small personal items that parents had described to searchers 64 years earlier. Most poignant was a small brass locket, green with age but still bearing the barely visible initials KM. Kendrick's middle name had been May, after her grandmother. Sheriff Hutchins contacted the few remaining family members, distant cousins who'd heard stories but never expected physical confirmation, elderly neighbors who remembered the search efforts, children and grandchildren of people who'd been involved in the original investigation. The bones would receive proper burial in the Deadfall Hollow Cemetery, with headstones paid for by the county and a small ceremony recognizing the tragedy that had shaped their community's history. Funny thing, Sheriff Hutchins mentioned to Dr. Coleman as the excavation concluded. My mother spent years trying to prove those girls were murdered, not drowned. Turned out to be right, but it took a drought to prove it. Phyla had died in 1968, 5 years before the creek gave up its secrets. She'd lived long enough to see Auric Caldwell die in prison and Elvin Willis released after serving 15 years of his 20-year sentence. She'd watched the Hollow slowly recover from the trauma of learning that neighbors could kill children for money. But she'd never seen the physical proof that her suspicions had been correct. Sometimes justice takes longer than people who seek it, Dr. Coleman observed. But the mountain keeps its own timeline. Water remembers everything, even when we forget. The remains of Kendrick and Verena were buried on a bright October morning, exactly 64 years after they'd walked into the woods for the last time. The ceremony was small but respectful. A Methodist minister, a few dozen relatives and neighbors, and a simple gravestone that read, Kendrick and Verena, beloved daughters, lost too soon. Sheriff Hutchins spoke briefly about his mother's determination to find truth and justice for children she'd barely known. Dr. Coleman explained how geological forces had finally delivered the evidence that human investigation had failed to uncover. And Brendan Mackay, the fisherman whose discovery had started it all, simply said that he was grateful the girls could finally rest in a proper place. The story should have ended with the burial, but mountains don't observe human schedules for closure. 3 months after Kendrick and Verena were laid to rest in marked graves, heavy rains filled the creek system and exposed additional remains in locations downstream from Brendan's original discovery. These weren't children's bones. Dr. Coleman's analysis identified them as belonging to 3 adult males, all dead for approximately the same length of time as the twins. Dental work and personal effects suggested they were the miners who testified against Caldwell and Elvin during the 1915 trial, men who'd supposedly died in coal mine accidents in Ohio and West Virginia during the years following the prosecution. "Looks like someone wanted to eliminate all the witnesses," Sheriff Hutchins told the assembled team of state investigators who'd returned to examine the new discovery. The miners who testified probably thought they were safe once they left Kentucky, but Caldwell had a long reach and a longer memory. FBI involvement was inevitable once the scope of the conspiracy became clear. What had seemed like a contained local crime in 1915 was revealed to be part of a larger pattern of murder and intimidation that had crossed state lines and continued for years after the original convictions. Federal agents began investigating similar disappearances in mining communities across Appalachia, looking for connections to Caldwell's business associates and financial backers. The investigation ultimately identified 12 additional murders linked to illegal mining operations that Caldwell had controlled or influenced between 1908 and 1918. The victims included federal inspectors, rival miners, local officials who'd refused to be bought, and family members who'd asked too many questions about missing relatives. Justice delayed, but not denied. Most of the perpetrators were long dead, but several business associates and financial backers were still alive and vulnerable to prosecution for conspiracy and accessory charges. The trials that followed made national headlines as the scope of corruption in Appalachian mining became clear to the general public. For Deadfall Hollow, the revelations were both vindication and tragedy. Phyla Hutchins's determination to seek truth had been proven correct, but the truth was more horrible than anyone had imagined. Their community hadn't just harbored 2 murderers. It had been the center of a criminal enterprise that had killed more than a dozen people over the course of a decade. "Makes you wonder who else we trusted that we shouldn't have," observed Azenra Willis's granddaughter during one of the community meetings held to process the ongoing discoveries. "Makes you wonder what else is buried up there in places we haven't looked yet." Sheriff Hutchins decided that some questions were better left unasked. The mountain had revealed enough secrets for one generation. Further excavation might uncover more bodies, more evidence of crimes that had no living perpetrators to prosecute. Sometimes knowing the truth was less important than being able to sleep at night. The creek returned to its normal flow patterns by the following spring. Trees and undergrowth reclaimed the exposed banks where archaeologists had worked. Within a few years, you had to know exactly where to look to find any evidence of the excavation sites or the terrible secrets they'd revealed. But people remembered, and stories were passed down through generations of families who'd learned that mountain communities could harbor darkness as deep as any mine shaft, secrets as enduring as stone. Today, if you drive through Deadfall Hollow on State Route 421, you'll find a historical marker near the creek bridge that mentions the discovery of human remains in 1973 and the Oobahisa prosecution of a mining conspiracy that spanned multiple decades. It's the kind of roadside historical marker that most travelers ignore, focused on reaching their destinations rather than contemplating old tragedies. But local people still know the story, still point out the bend in the creek where the bones were found, the sealed mining site up near Widow's Peak, the cemetery where Kendrick and Verena finally found rest after 6 decades of waiting. And sometimes, particularly during drought years when the water runs low and the creek banks are exposed, people claim they find things that shouldn't be there. Artifacts from the mining operation, personal effects that might have belonged to other victims, evidence of crimes that no one has been brave enough to investigate. The mountain keeps its secrets until it decides not to. Water remembers everything, even when we forget. And sometimes, when the conditions are exactly right, the past surfaces to remind us that justice might be slow, but rarely gives up entirely. Some say that on very quiet nights, when the mist hangs low in the hollow and the creek runs silent over worn limestone, you can still hear children's voices calling from places where no children should be. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.